as Jonathan Price fought back against the man who robbed him at the Quality outside of the Austin City Saloon, the identity of that robber became clear. The identity that's encoded in every cell of our body. There's no eyewitness, no video, no photographic lineup that reveals the identity of that robber. But there is genetic markers, alleles, DNA, found under Mr. Price's fingernails. DNA that excludes Dawan Mulazim. DNA that excludes Quincinio Canada. But before Detective Wolf learned the results of that DNA analysis, he had already decided who his suspects were. Facing immense pressure to solve a high-profile murder in a summer of high-profile murders, Detective Wolf and the Lexington Police Department assumed they knew who did it. They assumed it was Dawan Mulazim. They assumed it was Quincinio Canada. In making that assumption, they ignored information from a local attorney saying he had a client who wanted to meet with the police about this very case. They ignored numerous tips from numerous citizens about this very incident. They even ignored information from fellow law enforcement officers. They also disregarded the fact that the Springfield XDS, the weapon they believed was linked to Mr. Price's death, was found in the hands of Antonio Fry, not Dawan Mulazim, not Quincinio Canada. And despite the fact that no eyewitness, not a frame of video, shows gold teeth or facial tattoos, they proceeded against Mr. Mulazim and Mr. Canada. They had their suspects, and once this assumption was formed, it would not be revisited. Police used a shell casing found in the parking lot of the Austin City Saloon to try to tie in the robbery of Shane Hansford, Jessica Rutherford, and Mitchell Smith at a Quality Inn on Newtown Pike in June of 2014. During that robbery, Mr. Smith's Springfield XDS firearm was taken. You will hear that Ms. Rutherford, now Ms. Hansford, and Mr. Hansford were standing outside of their hotel room when they were approached by two black men. The two men quickly pulled guns and forced the couple into the hotel room. In that short time, they couldn't tell if the men were short or tall, thin or stocky. They noticed they were black men, but not their complexion, whether they were light-skinned or dark-skinned. Mitchell Smith was already in the hotel room, and all three lay face down on their beds. And once in that room, there was little time or ability to see the robbers. They called 911 and told police what they saw. They didn't note anything about the people's voices or the words they said to each other. They didn't mention any distinguishing features like facial tattoos or gold teeth. And that investigation went untouched until police came to believe that the gun taken from Mr. Hansford that night was fired outside of the Austin City Saloon. Then, police tried to prop up their assumptions, trying to get the identification Megan Price couldn't give them from Jessica Hansford, Shane Hansford, or Mitchell Smith. But, since neither Smith nor Hansford nor Miss Rutherford mentioned a facial tattoo, the police photoshopped out Mr. Canada's tattoo. They showed everyone lineups containing pictures of Dawan Mulazim and Quincinio Canada. Miss Rutherford was unable to say who robbed her at the Quality Inn. Mr. Smith did not identify Mr. Mulazim as being involved and said that the robber could be either Mr. Canada or another gentleman. Mr. Hansford said nothing about Mr. Canada and identified Mr. Mulazim based on a feeling. When specifically asked his level of certainty, Mr. Hansford said, "The longer I look at these photos, the more I feel." Number 5, the longer I look at these photos, number 5 is who I feel robbed me. You will hear that our minds fail to properly record information. It's not a tape recorder or a digital camera. And in fact, our minds fill in the gaps that our memory leaves. Over time, we may become more confident, more certain, even though we're not correct. Even though only 1 of 3 persons gave any indication that Mr. Mulazim was involved, and again, only 1 of 3 people gave any indication that Mr. Canada may be involved, the police rushed forward with the assumption that both of these gentlemen were the robbers at the Quality Inn Hotel, and they were involved in Mr. Price's death. They assumed, without proof, that these offenses were tied, only collecting casings from Mr. Hansford after they came to believe that gun was involved at the Austin City. And as police were hoping to fill in the gaps in their murder investigation, they failed to take basic steps to document their investigation into the Quality Inn robbery. None of the conversations with Mr. Hansford, Ms. Rutherford, Mr. Smith are recorded. He may have said something about his stomach when looking at a photo lineup. There's no audio of that. It's not documented in any way. No one collected evidence for forensic analysis. Police were at the Quality Inn that night. They didn't swab a single drawer, the doorknob, anything. You'll hear that Mr. Hansford recovered his cell phone. No analysis was done to determine who was there, who possessed that item. In fact, almost 40 years went by before someone thought to take that photo you saw a few moments ago. Police stretched the claim that someone from the Quality Inn heard one of the men call the other nephew to try to link Mulazim and Canada to the crime. For that claim about someone saying nephew was never made to Officer Harris, the officer who was at the Quality Inn that night. Police assumed that this nephew word implicated Dawan and Quincinio. But for that to have meaning, it would have to be rare for men to call each other uncle and nephew, an assumption that isn't true in many communities. You'll also hear from Mr. Woods, that tremendous story that you heard referenced a moment ago, a story that wasn't told until about 6 months after the crime, a story that he subsequently has said he made up and said only what the officers wanted him to say. But once police knew what Mr. Mulazim looked like and decided he was, and assumed he was the person at the Austin City Saloon parking lot that night, they scrutinized the surveillance video, which before hadn't led to any suspects, and tried to find meaning in it. You will see video from the Danny Scott liquor store, which is in the same plaza as the Austin City Saloon. Despite the fact that this video shows only seconds of a person making a purchase at the drive-thru, officers assumed this person was Mr. Mulazim. They further assumed there was a second person in the car. They based that assumption off of a brief flicker of light that could be anything from a cigarette lighter to a cell phone to the reflection or lighting of a passenger side mirror. police further assumed that this second person was Mr. Canada. And you'll see other video from that parking lot. They assume that the silver Malibu leaving the drive-thru is the same car that pulled behind the shopping center. There are portions of this parking lot that are not viewable in the surveillance video. But officers assume that the silver Malibu proceeded toward New Circle and around the shopping center instead of going any other number of places. Officers assume that once behind the shopping center, the car remained there for 9 minutes. The area behind that shopping center connects through to Codell Drive, but officers assume the car didn't continue driving away. Officers further assumed that at the end of this 9 minutes, the occupants left the car and approached Mr. and Mrs. Price in the parking lot. But there's no evidence linking the figures the video shows walking into the parking lot to that silver Malibu or any car. There is no way to know where they came from. But police assumed these people were tied to Rayetta Hudson's car. Without this assumption, they wouldn't have a suspect. Without this assumption, they wouldn't have a name to give Mr. Price's family. Without this assumption, it would be an unsolved robbery, an unsolved murder. Officers ignored the fact that right after Mr. Price was shot, a perimeter was established around the Austin City Saloon. They pulled surveillance videos from all over that part of the city. Mr. Canada and Mr. Mulazim were not apprehended in the perimeter or seen on the video because they weren't the two people that tried to rob Mr. and Mrs. Price. Instead, police assumed they committed that offense and essentially vanished without a trace. Months later, police actually recovered Mr. Hansford's .45 caliber Springfield XDS, but by September 2nd, 2014, they already had their suspects and their assumption of guilt. So they ignored the fact that the person who sold it to the ATF agent, the only person known to have been in possession of that gun, is a black man who could meet the description of the robbers at the Quality Inn Hotel or the Austin City Saloon. They stretched the ballistics evidence. They claimed that the shell casings fired by the Springfield XDS taken from Mr. Hansford have markings consistent with those found on a shell casing found at the parking lot of an Austin City Saloon. Use your common sense. Doesn't Springfield want all XDS .45 caliber handguns to be the same? Are they trying to make guns that leave unique markings on bullets, unique stamps on shell casings? Or are they trying to make guns that fire round after round safely and consistently? At its core, the testing you will hear about relies on unproven assumptions. The idea that the markings on the casings from Mr. Hansford's Springfield XDS and the casing in the Austin City parking lot are consistent is the only connection between the XDS taken from Mr. Hansford and the cartridge found on the ground outside of the Austin City Saloon. Without this connection, the information provided by Ms. Rutherford, Mr. Hansford, and Mr. Smith has no bearing on what happened to Mr. Price. Further wanting to shore up their assumption, police gathered cell phone location data. Police assumed that the cell towers show how a phone moved through the city. In reality, this information does not pinpoint the location of a call. All it means is that a phone is within the footprint of a particular tower. You will hear zero evidence about the size of these footprints. That's because AT&T won't tell us. It's a secret they're holding. The pictures you may see, the maps, the shaded circles, that's a guess. We don't know how big the area that these cell phone towers cover. They will ask you to assume they are small, but the diameter of that circle of cell phone coverage can be tens of miles. And you will hear that a phone may not connect to the closest cell phone tower. More importantly, police assumed that Quincinio Canada or Dawan Mulazim had the phone on both June 15th and June 21st, 2014. Listen for any evidence to support that assumption. Officers stretched this evidence and maintained this assumption, despite the fact that the only hard science they had, the DNA found under Mr. Price's fingernails, excludes Mr. Mulazim and Mr. Canada. Police never sent another person's DNA profile to the lab to be analyzed. They never tried to identify this person whose DNA is under Mr. Price's fingernails. They had their assumption and ignored what didn't fit. The police, the Commonwealth, have been blinded by their incorrect theory and may ask you to ignore evidence that does not fit, including evidence placing another individual at the scene. The police have no eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence, and no physical evidence linking Mr. Mulazim or Mr. Canada to Jonathan and Megan Price. The forensic evidence, the DNA found under Mr. Price's fingernails, exonerates them. The only physical evidence, the gun they tied to the crime scene, was taken from Antonio Fry, not Dawan or Quincinio. The assumption made by the police is just that, an assumption. And we talked about the river of reasonable doubt, how building a bridge from the innocent side of the river to the guilty side of the river is the only way the Commonwealth can earn a conviction. But crossing this river is not easy. Each element of each crime must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Strip away the assumptions. Focus on the evidence. Find them not guilty.